January 24, 1948. Montelupich Prison, Krakow. A woman stands on a wooden platform, hands bound behind her back. Just weeks earlier, she was the most feared woman in Adolf Hitler's entire concentration camp system. A woman prisoners called the Beast. A woman who could send 20,000 people to the gas chambers with a single nod. Now she is begging for her life, begging for mercy she never once gave to anyone else. Her name was Maria Mandl, and for 3 years, she was the highest-ranking woman in the deadliest place on earth, Auschwitz-Birkenau. This is the story of how an ordinary Austrian girl became one of history's cruelest killers, and how she met her end on the very gallows she helped fill with other people's ghosts. Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about cruelty. It's about how ordinary people become capable of unimaginable things. Before she was a monster, Maria Mandl was just a girl from a small Austrian town called Münzkirchen. She was born on January 10, 1912, into a comfortable, respectable Catholic family. Her father was a shoemaker. Her family had ties to Austria's Christian Social Party. Nothing radical, nothing that hinted at the horror to come. By all early accounts, there was nothing remarkable about Maria's childhood. She worked ordinary jobs as a postal clerk in local shops. She was, in many ways, invisible. The kind of person history usually forgets. No violent past, no documented cruelty. Just a quiet young woman in a quiet Austrian town, living an unremarkable life that gave no hint of what was to come. But in 1938, everything changed. Nazi Germany annexed Austria in what's known as the Anschluss. And like thousands of other Austrians, Maria Mandl saw opportunity in the new regime. She moved to Munich and applied for a job that would rewrite the rest of her life. She became a guard, an Aufseherin, at Lichtenburg concentration camp. She was 26 years old. At this point, she was just one of thousands of ordinary Germans and Austrians swept up in a regime that offered power and purpose to anyone willing to enforce its will. What set Maria Mandl apart wasn't how she started. It was what she chose to do once she had that power in her hands. At Lichtenburg, something in Maria Mandl changed, or perhaps something that was always there simply found permission to surface. Survivors and historical records describe her subjecting prisoners to brutal, often fatal beatings. She discovered that she had power, real, absolute power over human lives, and she used it without hesitation. In 1939, the SS transferred her to Ravensbrück, a camp built specifically for women. There, her cruelty didn't go unnoticed. It got her promoted. She rose to Oberaufseherin, head overseer, one of the highest positions a woman could hold in the entire Nazi camp system. Survivors would later testify that Mandl seemed to draw a strange, unsettling pleasure from violence. She wasn't just following orders. She appeared to relish her role. This detail matters because it separates Mandl from the common historical defense so many Nazi officials leaned on after the war. The claim that they were simply following commands, simply doing their duty. Those who survived Ravensbrück described something different. A woman who seemed to enjoy her position of absolute control over other human beings, who used it not out of obligation, but out of appetite. And then, in 1942, she received the assignment that would make her infamous. She was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau and appointed Schutzhaftlagerführerin, the camp leader of the entire women's section. She was 30 years old, and she was now, quite literally, one of the most powerful women in Heinrich Himmler's entire empire of death. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, Maria Mandl held the power of life and death over tens of thousands of women. Survivors nicknamed her the Beast. Others called her the Angel of Death of Auschwitz, an eerie echo of the title later attached to Josef Mengele. She was known to select prisoners for the gas chambers personally, sometimes seemingly on a whim. Historians estimate she was directly involved in selections that sent as many as 500,000 people to their deaths. But what made Mandl even more chilling wasn't just her cruelty, it was her contradictions. Survivors described a woman who could beat a prisoner unconscious one moment, and in the next, be found alone, playing the piano, seemingly lost in her own private world. Some witnesses described her as almost trance-like at these moments, a strange, quiet detachment from the horror surrounding her. And in one of the most unsettling chapters of her story, Maria Mandl personally founded the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz. Yes, an orchestra, inside a death camp. She handpicked talented female prisoners, many of them Jewish musicians, and forced them to perform. Sometimes they played as new prisoners marched toward the gas chambers, the music masking the screams and confusion of people walking to their deaths. Other times, Mandl would summon musicians privately, seemingly for her own personal enjoyment. It was one of the darkest ironies of the Holocaust. Beauty weaponized as an instrument of psychological terror. Music that should have symbolized hope and humanity instead became the soundtrack to systematic murder, a haunting backdrop engineered by a woman who understood exactly what she was doing. To the women in her orchestra, Mandl could show flashes of something resembling favor, even protection. Some musicians later admitted that being chosen for the orchestra likely saved their lives, sparing them from the harshest labor and, in some cases, from selection for the gas chambers. But this was never mercy. It was possession. She decided who among them mattered and who didn't. Survivors later testified that she could switch between calm affection and horrifying violence within moments, a trait that made her more terrifying, not less. One moment she could be found weeping at a piece of music. The next, she could order a woman beaten within an inch of her life for the smallest infraction. This unpredictability was, in many ways, the essence of her power. Prisoners never knew which version of Maria Mandl they would face, the woman lost in music, or the one who could end their lives without blinking. By the time the war neared its end, Maria Mandl's name had become synonymous with fear itself inside Birkenau's women's camp. By late 1944 and early 1945, the war was turning decisively against Nazi Germany. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. Auschwitz was evacuated, and its staff scattered, many trying to disappear into the chaos of a collapsing regime. Maria Mandl fled to her home region in Austria, likely hoping to vanish quietly back into the life she'd left behind 7 years earlier, to disappear back into obscurity, back into being just another unremarkable woman from a small Austrian town. But the world was not going to forget what happened at Auschwitz. And it was not going to forget her. As Allied forces swept across Europe, the full scale of what had happened inside the Nazi camp system was becoming horrifyingly clear. Liberated prisoners gave testimony, and Maria Mandl's name was near the top of the list of those the Allies were determined to find. In August 1945, American forces captured Maria Mandl in the mountains of Austria. She was extradited to Poland, where the true reckoning for her crimes was about to begin. On November 24, 1947, the Auschwitz trial began in Kraków, Poland, before the Supreme National Tribunal. 40 former Auschwitz staff members stood accused: guards, doctors, administrators. Maria Mandl was among the most notorious defendants, alongside former camp commandant Arthur Liebehenschel and the infamous SS doctor Johann Kremer. During the trial, survivor after survivor took the stand. They described the beatings, the selections, the orchestra, the casual, chilling cruelty of a woman who held their lives in her hands and often chose death without a flicker of hesitation. For many of these witnesses, it was the first time Maria Mandl had to sit, powerless, and listen to the consequences of what she'd done. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no ambiguity, no reasonable doubt. Maria Mandl was found guilty of crimes against humanity. On December 22, 1947, the tribunal handed down its verdict: death. Of the 40 defendants tried, 23, including Maria Mandl, were sentenced to hang. And this is where the story turns, where the woman who commanded fear finally came face to face with it herself. According to historical accounts, as her execution date approached, Maria Mandl, the woman who had sent countless others to die without mercy, pleaded for her own life to be spared. The same woman who ignored the screams, the tears, the desperate begging of thousands of prisoners in Birkenau was now the one begging. It didn't work. On January 24, 1948, just 2 weeks after her 36th birthday, Maria Mandl was executed by hanging at Montelupich prison in Kraków. She was one of several Auschwitz staff members put to death that same day, including Hans Allmeyer, Maximilian Grabner, and Karl Möckel. men who had also overseen unspeakable atrocities during their time at the camp. There was no final mercy, no last-minute reprieve. Just the quiet, grim symmetry of justice finally catching up to a woman who had spent years deciding who lived and who died, only to discover, in her final moments, that she had no power left at all. The woman who once decided the fate of thousands with a glance now stood powerless herself, facing the one authority she couldn't manipulate, couldn't threaten, and couldn't escape. Today, Maria Mandl's name survives in survivor testimonies, in Holocaust historical archives, and in books like Susan J. Eiched's Mistress of Life and Death, which chronicles her chilling rise and fall in painstaking detail. Her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The architects of the Holocaust's cruelty weren't always distant, faceless bureaucrats. Some were young women from quiet Austrian towns, ordinary people who, given power over life and death, chose brutality again and again. Maria Mandl wasn't born a monster. She became one choice at a time. And when the world finally demanded she answer for those choices, her pleas for mercy meant nothing, because mercy was something she had never once been willing to give. Her orchestra, once a tool of psychological control, became something else entirely in the historical record, a haunting symbol of how even beauty and art can be twisted into instruments of terror when placed in the wrong hands. And her story remains one of the most studied examples of how deeply ordinary people can be transformed by power, ideology, and unchecked cruelty. Nearly 80 years later, Maria Mandl's name still surfaces whenever historians discuss the role women played within the machinery of the Holocaust, not as passive bystanders, but in her case, as active, willing architects of suffering. If you found this story as haunting as I did, make sure to subscribe, because there are more untold stories from history's darkest chapters coming. And let me know in the comments, what part of Maria Mandl's story disturbed you the most?